She was the most powerful woman in the building. Corner office, seven-figure salary, a name that made boardrooms go quiet. And at 11:43 on a Tuesday night, Landon Pierce found her dancing alone in the dark, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. He should have walked away, pretended he saw nothing, gone home to his silent apartment and his sleeping 5-year-old son. He didn't. That single moment, a wrong turn down a hallway he had no business being in, would unravel everything both of them thought they knew about survival, about loss, and about whether a person who has already buried someone they loved deserves to risk their heart again. This is their story. And it starts the way most real things do, with someone falling apart when they thought no one was watching. If this story already has you, drop a like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this one travels. The elevator doors opened at 9:47 p.m. onto a floor that had no business being this quiet. Landon Pierce stepped out with his laptop bag cutting into his shoulder, a half-eaten granola bar in his jacket pocket, and the specific brand of exhaustion that comes not from working too hard, but from having absolutely nowhere else to be. The 42nd floor of Vantara Capital's downtown tower was dim. Most of the overhead fluorescents powered down after 8, leaving only the warm glow of floor-level lighting along the corridor walls and the cold blue light bleeding out from monitor screens nobody had bothered to shut off. He worked on the 39th floor. He had no reason to be here. He'd come up because Gerald in IT had texted him about a misfiled quarterly projection, something about a shared drive folder that had been accidentally moved to executive-level access instead of departmental. And if Landon didn't retrieve it tonight, it would be flagged in tomorrow morning's compliance audit. It wasn't Gerald's fault. It wasn't really anyone's fault. It was just one of those small bureaucratic nightmares that fell to the person who stayed late. And Landon Pierce was always the person who stayed late. He followed the hallway toward the server access terminal near the executive suite, his footsteps muffled by the thick charcoal carpet, past the glass-walled conference rooms, past the row of framed impact reports and corporate awards that lined the eastern wall, past a credenza with a dying orchid that someone had apparently been watering too much, the soil dark and waterlogged, the petals browning at the edges. He noticed things like that. He noticed things like that because if he didn't keep his brain occupied, it drifted somewhere he didn't want it to go. He was 3 offices away from the terminal when he heard it. Music. Not loud. Not the kind of thing you'd notice unless you were alone on a silent floor at 9:47 at night with nothing but the hum of climate control and your own breathing for company. It was coming from behind the closed double doors of the corner office, the one with the brushed steel nameplate that read S. Blake, Chief Executive Officer. And it was something slow, something with a piano and a low, dragging tempo that felt more like a feeling than a song. Landon stopped. He told himself he stopped because he was surprised, because nobody was supposed to be up here this late, and hearing music from behind the CEO's door at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday was objectively strange. That was the reason he stopped. That was the only reason. He stood there for about 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than he should have, and then the door drifted open. Not all the way. Maybe 8 inches. The latch hadn't caught properly, and some movement inside had nudged it, but 8 inches was enough. The office was dark except for the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides and 42 floors below, Carver City was doing what Carver City always did at this hour, burning with light, restless, indifferent to whatever was happening up here in the glass and steel above it. The skyline threw just enough illumination into the room to see shapes, and the shape Landon saw stopped him in a way that the music hadn't. Serena Blake was dancing, alone, eyes closed. Her heels were off. Landon could see them on their sides near the desk, carelessly dropped. She was in her work clothes still, charcoal slacks and a silk blouse, but her jacket was gone and her hair, which every person in this company had only ever seen in a precise low bun, was down around her shoulders. She had her arms wrapped around herself the way you do when there's nobody else to hold you, and she was moving, slowly, barely, in a way that wasn't really dancing so much as it was standing still while everything inside her moved. And she was crying. Not the polite, controlled kind. Not the kind you did in bathrooms with tissues and composure. She was crying, The way people cry when they're certain they're alone. From somewhere low and structural, the kind of crying that sounds almost like it hurts, slow and ragged and completely unguarded. Landon should have backed away. Any reasonable person would have backed away. He'd been frozen there for maybe 2 seconds, 10 at most, it was hard to tell, when she turned. Not fully, not toward the door. She turned toward the windows, and the city light caught her face, and Landon saw everything in 1 second that she had spent what looked like years making sure no one ever saw. She looked wrecked. Not dramatically, not cinematically, just genuinely deeply wrecked. Like someone who had been holding something extremely heavy for a very long time and had finally, for just this 1 hour in this empty office, put it down. He stepped back. He didn't mean to make a sound. His heel caught the edge of a floor vent, a small metallic click, and that was all it took. Serena's head snapped toward the door. For one long, terrible moment, they just looked at each other through the 8-inch gap. Her with her arms still folded around herself, face wet, eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it. Him with his hand frozen on the strap of his laptop bag, caught completely, not a single plausible explanation forming in his head. Then she crossed the room in 4 fast steps and pulled the door open the rest of the way. She was taller than he'd realized. In the presentations and all-hands meetings where he'd seen her before, she always seemed contained by the frame of a slide or a podium. Standing 6 feet from him in her stocking feet with her face still damp from crying, she was just a person, and that was somehow more disorienting than anything else. "Who are you?" Not a question. Flat and controlled, though her voice had a raw edge that she couldn't entirely iron out. "Landon Pierce," he said. "Finance, the 39th floor. There was a misfiled document. Gerald from IT asked me to." He stopped himself because he was rambling, and he knew it. And rambling made him sound guilty of something when all he was guilty of was being in the wrong place. "I'm sorry. I heard the music, and I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "How long were you standing there?" I just... The door was open. I was walking past. "How long?" He could have lied. He probably should have lied. But there was something about standing there in the near dark, with the city burning behind her, and her face still clearly showing evidence of the last 10 minutes, that made a lie feel obscene. "Maybe 30 seconds, he said. "I'm sorry." Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not yet, nowhere close to warmth, but the rigid professional surface cracked just slightly, the way ice sounds when weight settles onto it. She looked at him for another moment, and then she stepped back from the door. "Come in and close it," she said, "before someone else comes by." He almost said no. He almost said, "I'll go, I'm sorry, good night," and walked back to the elevator and let the door of that office become a wall between him and everything he'd just seen. But she'd already turned away, and the instruction had a tired certainty to it that didn't really leave room for argument, and so he stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind him. She had turned the music off. The room felt much more silent without it. Serena moved to her desk and picked up a folded cloth, a handkerchief which struck Landon as oddly formal, and pressed it briefly to her face. Then she set it down and turned to face him, with her arms crossed and her chin level. And if you'd walked in right at that second with no context, you might almost have believed she was just annoyed at an interruption rather than a woman who'd been crying alone in the dark 3 minutes ago. "You won't say anything about this?" she said. It was the kind of sentence that was phrased as a statement but meant as a question. "No," Landon said. "Of course not." "I don't need your 'of course.' I need an actual answer." "Then the actual answer is no. I won't say anything." She studied him. He'd seen her before. Everyone at Vantara had seen Serena Blake. She was the face on the annual report, the voice behind the company-wide addresses, the person whose decisions affected 700 employees, including the one standing awkwardly in her dark office right now. But he'd never been looked at by her directly, and the experience was unexpectedly uncomfortable. She was precise about it, the way she looked at him. Clinical? "Why not?" she said. "Because it's not my business. You're a finance manager. You're mid-level. You've been here." She glanced somewhere past him, accessing the information from memory. 3.5 years. You could use this. Use it how? I don't know. People find ways. Landon shifted his bag off his shoulder and held it in one hand for something to do with his hands. Ms. Blake, I have a 5-year-old at home who needs me to have this job. I'm not here to create problems. I came up for a document, and I'm going to get the document and go home. He paused. I'm sorry for what I saw. I mean that. The word home seemed to land somewhere on her in a way he didn't fully understand yet. She unfolded her arms, sat down in the chair behind her desk, not behind it exactly. She angled it sideways, away from the formal position, and let out a breath. Sit down, she said. For 1 minute. Then you can go get your document. Oh. He sat in the chair across from her, the one clients probably used, firm and slightly too upright. Outside the windows, Carver City kept burning. A plane crossed the upper right corner of the frame, its lights blinking red and white, heading somewhere Landon had never been and probably wouldn't go. You have a child, she said. Mason. He's 5. Where is he now? Neighbor downstairs, Mrs. Okafor. She watches him when I work late, which is... He paused. More often than I'd like. His mother? The question wasn't unkind. It was just direct, which seemed to be her default setting. Landon turned the laptop bag strap between his fingers. She died, he said. 2 years ago. Car accident on the bridge over Route 9. Black ice. She was on her way back from visiting her sister. Serena didn't say I'm sorry. He appreciated that. He'd received so many I'm sorries in the past 2 years that the words had become essentially meaningless. Little verbal reflexes people had when they didn't know what else to do. Instead, she just nodded, and the nod had weight in it. How do you... She started, and then stopped. How do I what? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the plane had disappeared. The city glittered. She looked at the windows instead of at him when she finally spoke. How do you still come to work every day? Landon thought about it. He gave it real consideration instead of the automatic answer people expected. You keep going. You do it for your kid, one day at a time. All the things that were true but felt thin when you actually said them out loud. Some days I don't know, he said. Some days I come in and do my job, and I go home and help Mason with dinner and read to him, and it almost feels like being a person. And some days I sit in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes because I can't make myself get on the elevator. And I don't tell anyone about the car days because nobody needs to hear it, and it doesn't change anything anyway. She turned from the windows and looked at him. I had a daughter, she said. Landon went still. Her name was Ivy. She said the name carefully, like she was handling something that could break. She was 4. She and my husband, Daniel... She paused, and in the pause, Landon could hear the way she'd trained herself to get through sentences like this. They were driving home from her gymnastics class. A truck on the highway lost control. They said Daniel didn't suffer. They said Ivy... Another pause, shorter but harder. They said she didn't either. How long ago? 6 years. The room was very quiet. I'm sorry, Landon said, and then immediately felt the inadequacy of it, the very thing he'd just been thinking about. So am I, she said, without any performance in it. They sat there for a moment, 2 people in a dark office above a city that didn't know or care what had just been exchanged between them. The dancing, Landon said carefully. The music. Is that... The song was what was playing in the car before they left, she said. She'd made me play it 4 times on the way to gymnastics. She used to spin in circles in the kitchen whenever it came on. She looked down at her hands. I listen to it sometimes. It's not... I know it doesn't make sense. It makes sense, Landon said. She looked at him, and for the first time there was something in her expression that wasn't assessment or professionalism or the careful management of what she allowed to be seen. There was just a kind of exhausted recognition. The way you look at someone who has said something true. Go get your document, she said. It wasn't unkind. It's late. He got the document. He came back past her office on the way to the elevator, and the double doors were closed, and the music was not playing. He stood there for maybe 3 seconds, not eavesdropping, not doing anything, just standing. And then he pressed the elevator button and went down to the parking garage and sat in his car. Not 20 minutes this time. just 5. 5 minutes of sitting in the quiet with his hands on the wheel and the engine off, thinking about a woman dancing alone to a song her daughter had loved, and about how people built entire architectures around their grief, entire professional identities, and 70-hour work weeks and immaculate postures, and how all of it could come apart in a dark office when nobody was supposed to be watching. He thought about Claire, his wife. The way she smelled in the morning before she'd had coffee, slightly sour and warm. The way she talked to Mason when she thought Landon wasn't listening. Soft and silly and completely unlike the person she was in front of other people. He thought about the night the police came to the door and how the first thing he'd thought, strangely, was I need to call Claire before the reality had finished arriving. He started the car and drove home. Mrs. Okafor was a 63-year-old retired teacher who lived in 4B and had been watching Mason since the beginning of March 2 years ago, when Landon had come back to work and needed someone who would genuinely care and not just be present. She was a large woman with close-cropped gray hair and a laugh like a truck backfiring, and Mason adored her in the specific and total way that 5-year-olds adore people who feed them warm food and don't rush them. "He's asleep," she said, opening her door before Landon could knock. She could tell his footsteps. "Went down at 9. I let him stay up 30 extra minutes because he wanted to finish his book." "What was he reading?" "He was having me read it, the one with the elephants." Landon smiled. "He knows all the words. He just likes being read to." "Smart boy." She handed him a small foil-wrapped plate. "Jollof rice. You look like you haven't eaten." He hadn't. The granola bar didn't count. He thanked her, carried his sleeping son. Mason barely stirred, just made a small sound, and tucked his face against Landon's neck. Upstairs, and laid him in his bed. He sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment in the dark, listening to his son breathe, which was a thing he still did every night, and probably would for a long time. Mason had Claire's eyelashes, the same way of sleeping with one hand curled under his chin. He looked peaceful in a way that 5-year-olds could look peaceful because they hadn't yet learned all the reasons not to be, and Landon felt the familiar thing. Not quite grief, not quite love, something that lived between them and contained both, move through his chest and settle. He ate the jollof rice standing over the kitchen sink at 10:45 p.m. and thought about nothing in particular, which was a small victory. 3 days passed. He saw Serena Blake exactly once in those 3 days. Briefly, at the end of a departmental briefing where she'd stopped in for the last 10 minutes, asked 2 pointed questions about the Q3 projections, gotten 2 slightly nervous answers from his department head, and left. She was composed and precise and wore her authority the way she always had, like it was just the shape of her rather than something she put on. She didn't look at him. He told himself that was fine. That was correct. That was how this was supposed to go. A strange moment in an empty office, a conversation that happened because a door didn't latch properly, and now back to the ordinary order of things. He was a finance manager. She was the CEO. There was no version of the universe where what happened on the 42nd floor at 9:47 p.m. became something. On the 4th day, he found a note on his desk. A physical note, folded in half, no envelope, his name on the front in handwriting that was precise and slightly left-leaning. Landon Pierce, Finance, 39th floor. He opened it. Coffee. Thursday. 7:15 a.m. The place on Wellman Street with the green door, not the lobby cafe. SB. He stared at it for longer than was probably reasonable. Then he put it in his desk drawer under the quarterly audit file, which was the nearest thing he had to a private space, and went back to his spreadsheets. Thursday morning he woke up at 6, which was earlier than he needed to, and stood in the kitchen drinking coffee he'd made himself, while Mason ate cereal at the small table and told a lengthy story about something that had happened at preschool involving a stuffed giraffe and an accusation of wrongdoing that Mason considered deeply unjust. And then Tyler said it was mine, but it wasn't mine. It was the classroom's giraffe, and I told him that, and he didn't listen. People often don't listen, Landon said. Is that true everywhere or just at school? Everywhere. Mason considered this. That's bad. Yeah. Landon rinsed his mug. Finish your cereal, buddy. He dropped Mason at Mrs. Okafor's, she did the preschool run on Thursdays, and walked 6 blocks to Wellman Street and found the place with the green door. It was a narrow cafe that smelled like cardamom and old wood and had maybe 8 tables, all of them small. Serena was already there when he arrived, sitting in the back corner with her hands wrapped around a cup and her coat still on, like she hadn't decided yet whether to stay. She looked different without the context of Vantara. Smaller somehow, though she wasn't small. She looked like someone who was making a choice and wasn't completely sure about it. "You came," she said. "You didn't think I would?" "I didn't know." She looked at her coffee. "Sit down." He sat. The person who came to take his order was a young man with a nose ring who clearly recognized neither of them and asked what Landon wanted with the specific incuriosity of someone who had served hundreds of people that morning and would serve hundreds more. Landon ordered a black coffee. The young man left. "I don't do this," Serena said. "Do what?" "This." She gestured between them, a small, slightly uncomfortable motion. I don't have conversations with employees, personal conversations. She stopped, started again. "I haven't had a real conversation with anyone in about 3 years, maybe longer. I have colleagues, and I have assistants, and I have a board of directors, and I have," she paused, "professionals I see once a week who I pay to listen, and even with them I manage what I say. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you already know the thing I work the hardest to keep hidden," she said. "So the performance is a bit pointless." Landon's coffee arrived. He wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic and thought about that. "I have a question," he said, "and you don't have to answer it. Ask. The room you were in, your office, you were in there at 9:47 at night, alone, dancing to a song your daughter liked. Do you do that regularly?" She didn't flinch. "Yes." "How regularly?" "Tuesdays, most Tuesdays." "Why Tuesdays?" "Because the accident happened on a Tuesday." She said it flatly, factually, the way you said something you'd said to yourself 10,000 times and had worn the sharp edges off. "I started doing it the first year. I don't know why. I couldn't stop." Landon nodded. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't tell her it was understandable or that she should probably work on that or that grief took strange forms. He just nodded. "My wife," he said after a moment. "Claire. Her birthday was in October, and last October was the first one since she died, and I made her birthday cake, the one she always made herself. I'd watched her make it maybe 15 times, and I still had to look up the recipe because I couldn't remember the exact amounts. And it took me 3 hours, and it came out wrong. The texture was off. And I ate 2 pieces at the kitchen table at midnight and cried until I couldn't see. And Mason was asleep the whole time and didn't know." Serena was watching him. "I don't know why I did it," he said. "I know why," she said. "Yeah?" "Because you needed to do something with your hands. And you needed to be connected to her in a way that felt like an action rather than just sitting with it." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." On. They were there for an hour and 20 minutes. No one from Vantara walked in. No one recognized them. The young man with the nose ring refilled their coffees without being asked and otherwise left them alone. Outside, Wellman Street did its morning routine. Delivery trucks, dog walkers, a woman arguing on her phone, the ordinary, relentless machinery of a city that had no idea any particular conversation was happening inside any particular cafe. By the time they left, separately, 2 minutes apart, Serena first, Landon had told her about the drive home he still couldn't bring himself to make on the anniversary of Claire's accident, how he took a completely different route across town, even though it added 20 minutes. She had told him about the awards on her wall that she'd put up, not because she was proud of them, but because the wall looked worse without them. Bare walls made an office feel like a room you weren't planning to stay in, and she needed to feel like she was staying. He'd told her about the way Mason sometimes called for Claire in the middle of the night, in that half-asleep, not quite conscious way, just Mama, and how Landon would go in and sit on the edge of the bed and say, "I'm here, buddy," and Mason would settle back down without waking fully, and how Landon didn't know if Mason knew the difference in those moments or not, and couldn't decide which answer was harder. She had gone very quiet when he told her that. She'd told him that Ivy had been afraid of the dark, and they'd had a nightlight in her room shaped like a small cloud, and that she still had the nightlight. Hadn't plugged it in. Just had it. He hadn't said anything about that either, just nodded. The following Tuesday, he was on the 39th floor at 9:47 p.m. He was not on the 39th floor because of any document. He was there because he had stayed late for the specific and not entirely honest reason that he was a person who stayed late, and this particular Tuesday he had not gone up to the 42nd floor. He had stayed at his own desk and worked until 10:15, and then taken the elevator down to the garage and driven home by the long route, the one that added 20 minutes because it was Tuesday, and he always drove home by the long road on Tuesdays, and he didn't feel ready to stop yet. He did not think about Serena Blake dancing in her office. Or rather, he thought about it the way you think about something you've decided not to think about, which is to say constantly and sideways. He was pretty sure she was up there. He was pretty sure he was not going to go check. He drove home. He paid Mrs. Okafor. He read to Mason, The Elephant Book again, by request, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark listening to his son breathe and felt the weight of the apartment settle around him, the specific silence of a place that had been built for more people than it currently contained. The coffee had been real, though. The conversation had been real. Whatever it was they were doing, two people who had both had the same conversation 1,000 times inside their own heads finally having it out loud with someone who didn't need to be taught why it hurt. It was real. And he was not yet sure what to do with the fact that it had been for 1 hour and 20 minutes in a narrow cafe that smelled like cardamom, the least alone he'd felt in 2 years. He lay down on his bed without changing his clothes and looked at the ceiling and thought about that for a while. Outside, the city went on being the city. Inside apartment 7C, a man who had learned to build a life inside a grief he hadn't chosen lay in the dark and tried to figure out whether something that felt like hope was actually hope or just the cruel mimicry of it, and whether the difference mattered as much as he'd always told himself it did. He didn't arrive at an answer, but he was still thinking about it when he finally fell asleep just before 1 in the morning, which was something he hadn't done in a long time, fallen asleep with something on his mind besides the weight of the things he'd already lost. That was something. He wasn't sure yet what kind of something, but it was a start. The second Thursday came and went without a note on his desk, and Landon told himself that was fine, that the first time had been an anomaly, a pressure valve releasing after an accidental exposure, two strangers exchanging damage in a narrow cafe before returning to their respective positions in the hierarchy. That was what it had been. A single morning that existed outside the normal rules because the circumstances had been unusual, and unusual circumstances produced unusual behavior. And now the circumstances were ordinary again, so everything would be ordinary again. He believed this completely for about 4 days. On the 5th day, he found himself on Wellman Street at 7:10 in the morning buying a coffee he hadn't planned to buy, standing at the counter of the cafe with the green door and looking at the back corner table, the one they'd sat at, which was currently occupied by an older man reading a physical newspaper with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who had decided the world moved too fast and he wasn't going to participate in that. Landon ordered his coffee, drank it standing at a small ledge by the window, and watched the street. She didn't come. He hadn't expected her to. He didn't know why he was there. He finished his coffee and went to work and had a perfectly functional day and told himself the whole thing was done. The note came the following Tuesday. Same fold, same handwriting. Thursday, 7:15. Green door. Nothing else. He was there at 7:12. She was already in the back corner with her hands around a cup, coat on again. Same cautious posture of someone who hadn't fully committed to staying. But this time when he sat down, she didn't feel the need to explain herself first, and he didn't feel the need to pretend he wasn't glad she'd sent the note. "How was your week?" he said. "Brutal. Yours?" "Mason got a stomach bug Tuesday night. I was up until 4. "Is he okay?" "He's fine. He bounced back in about 12 hours because that's how 5-year-olds work. They're completely destroyed and then they're completely normal, and you're the one walking around looking like a crime scene." She almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. It was the cautious preliminary version, the kind that checks the structural integrity before committing. But it was real. I had a board member tell me this week that I seemed tired, she said, in front of 3 other board members. What did you say? I told him I was running a 700-person company, and if I didn't seem tired, I'd be doing something wrong. She picked up her cup. He didn't like that. Probably not. He's been on the board for 11 years. He thought I was going to thank him for his concern. Were you tired? Of course I was tired. She set the cup down. I'm always tired. I just don't need anyone to name it for me. That was the tone of the second Thursday. Less careful than the first, less weighted. They talk the way people talk when they've already done the hardest part, the initial exposure, and are now just figuring out the shape of whatever this is. It wasn't easy exactly. There were still pauses that lasted a beat too long, moments where one of them said something real and the other had to find their footing before responding. But it was genuine, and genuineness was rarer than either of them had admitted to themselves. He told her that Mason had asked last week why they didn't have more people at their house. He'd said, with the flat matter-of-fact honesty of a child who doesn't yet know how to soften things, Tyler has a mom and a dad and a grandma, and they all eat dinner together, and that's a lot of people. Landon had said they had Mrs. Okafor downstairs, and that was their people. Mason had thought about this and said okay, and gone back to his drawing, and Landon had stood at the kitchen counter for a few minutes after, not doing anything in particular. Serena listened to this without filling the silence that came after it. What did you do? She said eventually. Made dinner, pasta. The kind he likes with the butter and the cheese and nothing else, because he's 5 and he has the palate of a very small person with strong opinions. That sounds like the right answer. I don't always have the right answer. No, she said. But you showed up for it. That's different from having the answer. He looked at her. She was looking at her coffee again, and he wasn't sure she'd meant to say that with as much weight as it landed with. You think about it, he said. About whether you showed up. She didn't answer right away. A bus went past on Wellman Street, its engine loud and then receding. The man with the newspaper had been replaced by 2 women having a very animated discussion about something, their voices low but emphatic. Every day, Serena said. Every single day I think about the morning of the accident. Daniel had asked me the night before if I wanted to take Ivy to gymnastics myself. He was going to go into the office on Saturday morning. He often did. And he asked if I wanted to take her instead. She kept her eyes on the cup. I said no. I had a call with the Singapore office at 10 and I needed to prepare for it. I said no. Serena, I know. Her voice was flat, carefully so. I know what you're going to say. That I couldn't have known. That it wasn't my fault. I've been told those things by everyone who knew what happened and by 2 therapists and by people who mean well. And I know the argument. Intellectually, I know the argument. But I said no. She finally looked up. And they got in the car. And I was on a call with Singapore when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and I let it go to voicemail. A pause. I let it go to voicemail. The cafe noise went on around them, indifferent and ordinary. Landon sat with what she'd just handed him and didn't try to fix it, because it wasn't the kind of thing you fixed with words, and she'd heard all the words anyway. He thought about the bridge on Route 9. He thought about black ice and how it doesn't announce itself, how it just exists quietly on the road waiting for the moment to become catastrophic. He thought about how grief had a specific shape for every person, and hers had been forged in that one moment of a voicemail she didn't answer, and nothing he said was going to reshape it. I answered mine, he said quietly, when the police called. I answered on the second ring, and it didn't matter. She went very still. Answering or not answering. Neither of us could have changed it, he said. I know you know that. I also know knowing doesn't touch the part of you that thinks it anyway. She put one hand flat on the table and looked at it, a small gesture, self-steadying. No, she said. It doesn't. They sat with that for a minute, just sat with it without dressing it up, and something in the quality of the silence changed, became less like the silence between strangers and more like the silence between people who have agreed not to pretend. The Thursdays became a pattern. Not every week. Sometimes she had to travel. Sometimes his mornings were swallowed by Mason's preschool schedule or a work crisis that started before 7, but often enough that the cafe on Wellman Street began to feel like a fixed point. The young man with the nose ring, whose name turned out to be Rio, had stopped asking what they wanted and just brought 2 black coffees when they walked in, which they both found quietly amusing. They did not talk about Vantara. They did not talk about the professional distance that technically existed between a finance manager and a CEO, or about what people would think, or about the fact that this was unusual. Those subjects were present in the room the way certain furniture is present in a room. You're aware of it, you arrange yourself around it. You don't comment on it. What they talked about was everything else. She told him that when she'd first moved into the house she now lived in, a large, underfurnished place in the Dalverton Hills neighborhood that she'd bought 2 years after the accident because the apartment she'd shared with Daniel and Ivy had become impossible to stay in. She had furnished only the rooms she used: the living room, the master bedroom, the kitchen. The rest of the house she had simply closed the doors on. 4 closed doors. She knew what was behind each one without having to open them. He told her that he'd kept Claire's reading glasses on the nightstand for 8 months before he moved them. Not because he forgot they were there, because he couldn't decide where to put them, and moving them felt like making a decision he wasn't ready for, and the nightstand was the one place where not deciding was an option. "Where are they now?" she asked. "In a box in the closet, with some other things." He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. "It took me a whole Saturday to do it. Mason was at Mrs. Okafor's. I put on music and just went through things. I kept more than I probably should have, but I did it." "What made you finally do it?" Mason opened the nightstand drawer looking for a pen and pulled out the glasses and asked me what they were. And I said they were Mama's glasses. And he said, "Can Mama see without them?" And I didn't know what to say, and he just put them back in the drawer very carefully and closed it and went back to his drawing, and I sat on the bed for a while. He paused. "I did it the next weekend." Serena set down her cup. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him more often lately, with something that wasn't pity and wasn't the careful clinical assessment from that first night. Something more like recognition, the way you look at someone who keeps saying the thing you haven't been able to say. "He sounds like a remarkable kid." "He's 5, Mima. He's mostly concerned with whether there are enough crackers in the house and whether his stuffed elephant is in the right position on the bed before he sleeps." Landon almost smiled. "But yes, he's remarkable. Can I meet him?" The question came out with less preparation than she'd intended. He could tell because she looked faintly surprised by herself after she said it, the way you look when something comes out of your mouth ahead of your permission. He didn't answer immediately. That wasn't an ask for anything," she said. "I just meant, I know what you meant." He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things anymore. He thought about Mason, who trusted easily and attached quickly, and was at an age where people became important before you had time to explain the risks of that. He thought about what it would mean to introduce his son to a person who was, what exactly? A colleague. A person he had coffee with on Thursday mornings. A woman who kept a cloud-shaped nightlight on a shelf and didn't plug it in, and who cried alone on Tuesday nights to a song her daughter had loved. "Let me think about it," he said. She nodded. She didn't push. He appreciated that. He thought about it for 9 days. On the 10th day, he texted her. They had exchanged numbers somewhere around the 4th Thursday for logistics, and had used it exactly twice before this, both times for schedule changes, and said, "Mason likes the park on Greer Avenue. Saturday mornings around 10. If you wanted to come by, that's where we'll be." She texted back 40 minutes later. "Okay, just that." One word, which he'd noticed, was her characteristic approach to moments that had more weight than she wanted to assign directly. "Okay?" He'd come to understand it as the version of yes that didn't want to make too much of itself. He told Mason on Friday night that a friend of his from work might come to the park tomorrow. Mason asked if the friend liked elephants. Landon said he didn't know. Mason said that was probably fine because the park didn't have elephants anyway. It had the good slide and the thing you spin on, which in Mason's current estimation made it better than the other park on Clement Street, which only had regular swings and a climbing wall that was, quote, too hard but also kind of boring. "What's her name?" Mason asked. Landon paused. He hadn't said her. "Serena." That's a long name. It is. Can I call her something shorter? You can ask her what she'd like you to call her. Mason accepted this with the equanimity of a person who had more important things to think about, turned over in bed, and requested the elephant book. She was already at the park when they arrived, standing near the entrance with her hands in the pockets of a dark green coat, and she looked different again. Not the corporate Serena from Vantara, not the careful Serena from the cafe, but someone who was slightly unsure what to do with her hands and was managing it through the very deliberate act of keeping them in her pockets. Mason looked at her with the frank assessment that small children bring to new situations. "Are you Serena?" he said. "I am," she said. "That is a long name." "It is," she agreed. "You can call me Rena if you want. My sister used to." Mason considered. "Okay, do you like the spinning thing or the slide better?" "I've been away from playgrounds for a while," she said. "You might have to remind me." This was, apparently, exactly the right thing to say, because Mason immediately took it as a commission and grabbed her hand, the unself-conscious way children grab hands, without asking, and began leading her toward the equipment while delivering a comprehensive briefing on the park's features, their relative merits, and the correct technique for the spinning thing, which required you to hold the bar at a specific angle or you'd get dizzy wrong. Landon followed at a slight distance, watching. He watched her crouch down to Mason's level. He watched her listen with the same focused attention she brought to board presentations, completely genuine, as Mason demonstrated the spinning technique. He watched her take a turn on the spinning thing herself, her green coat fanning out slightly, and the laugh that came out of her was small and surprised, like it had come loose from somewhere she hadn't opened in a while. Mason thought this was excellent. "Again," Mason said. She went again. Landon sat on a bench with cold wood under him and the October sky doing its gray and pale blue thing overhead, and watched his son spin Serena Blake in circles on the playground equipment, and felt something move through him that was complicated and not entirely comfortable, and also, underneath all of that, warm. He had not expected warm. He didn't quite know what to do with warm. He put it aside to examine later, the way you set down something hot until you can handle it without burning yourself. They walked to a diner after the park, Mason's insistence, because he'd established a standing Saturday tradition of pancakes after the park with Landon, and had decided, with the executive certainty of a 5-year-old, that this tradition naturally included Serena. She had looked at Landon over Mason's head with an expression that asked, "Is this okay?" And Landon had shrugged and nodded, because it clearly was, and there was no point pretending otherwise. The diner was warm and smelled like coffee and butter, and the specific good smell of a griddle that had been in use since 6 in the morning. Mason ordered chocolate chip pancakes and then carefully removed all the chocolate chips and ate them first as an appetizer, which was apparently his standard practice, explained to Serena in complete seriousness as though this were self-evident logic. She ate scrambled eggs and asked Mason questions about his stuffed elephant, whose name Landon learned only now was Gerald, which struck him as very funny and which he was told with some dignity had been Mason's own choice, and listened to the answers with that same quality of real attention. Landon drank coffee and mostly just watched them talk. She was not performing ease. That was the thing. With some adults, kids could feel the performance, the brightness that was slightly too bright, the questions that were slightly too enthusiastic, the fundamental adult discomfort with being on a 5-year-old's conversational level. Serena had none of that. She was just present, genuinely interested. She asked follow-up questions. When Mason said something funny, she laughed without editing it. He thought about Ivy. He thought about how she'd been 4, and Serena had taken her to gymnastics 4 times a week, and what it cost her to sit here and talk to a small child about a stuffed elephant named Gerald, whether it was painful in the specific way that things could be painful and also good at the same time. He caught her eye at one point over Mason's head, and she looked not sad exactly, not the wrecked expression from The Office. Something more layered than that, more textured. She gave him a very small nod that he didn't entirely understand but somehow did. After the pancakes, on the sidewalk outside, Mason spotted a pigeon doing something interesting near a trash can and went to investigate with the full concentration of a scientist. Landon stood next to Serena and watched him. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For this. She didn't gesture toward Mason exactly, but he knew what she meant. You didn't have to. He wanted you here. Landon paused. And so did I. She looked at the middle distance. The pigeon had done whatever it was doing and moved on, and Mason was now examining the empty space where it had been with profound scientific interest. I'm not good at this, she said. At what? Letting people in. I got very practiced at not doing it. She said it without self-pity, just as a report. It's like a skill. Not letting people in. You get better at it every year. Yeah, he said. I know. And then she stopped, started again. And then something happens and you realize you've gotten so good at it that you can't remember how to go the other direction. You seem to be managing, he said. She looked at him sideways. I'm terrified. Me too, he said. They stood there in the October cold watching his son have a detailed conversation with a pigeon who had returned, apparently having completed its earlier business and arrived back with new ones, and neither of them said anything else, and neither of them moved away. And the gap between them on the sidewalk was the same as it had been, but it felt different now. Not empty, but charged, like the pause before something shifts. Mason eventually turned around, saw them both still standing there, and made a face that was too old for his age. Are you just standing there? He said. Yes, Landon said. Why? Because we're adults, and sometimes adults just stand places. Mason looked deeply unimpressed by this explanation and turned back to the pigeon. Serena made a sound that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. He's going to be a problem when he's older, she said. He's already a problem, Landon said, and he meant it with every bit of affection a person can mean something. They walked back together, all three of them, Mason between them, holding Landon's hand on the left, and having apparently decided, without announcement, to hold Serena's hand on the right, through streets that smelled like fallen leaves and coffee and city. And the morning was gray and ordinary and completely unremarkable to everyone except the two adults walking through it, both carrying the full weight of everything they'd lost, both discovering, carefully, and without quite naming it yet, that weight felt different when you weren't carrying it alone. The thing about happiness, Landon had learned, was that it didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with ceremony. It crept in sideways. Through Saturday mornings at the park, and pancakes with chocolate chips eaten in the wrong order, and a 5-year-old who had started asking with increasing frequency when Reno was coming over next. Through Thursday coffees that had started running long enough that Rio had stopped clearing their cups until they actually stood up. Through evenings at Serena's house in Dalverton Hills, where Mason sat on the kitchen counter and watched her cook. Badly, she was a genuinely terrible cook, which delighted Mason enormously. While Landon stood at the stove actually making the food and pretending to take instruction from her. They had not named what they were doing. Naming it would have required a conversation that both of them were privately circling without approaching directly. The way you circle something bright that you're not sure you can look at straight on. What they had instead was a rhythm, loose and real and slightly cautious, the way things are when the people building them have both been burned before and haven't forgotten how fire works. Mason had no such hesitation. Mason had decided that Serena was his and proceeded accordingly. He had started leaving drawings at her house. Not intentionally, Landon thought at first, just forgotten in the way things got left behind. But after the third one, he realized they were placed too deliberately. One on the kitchen counter, one on the side table near the couch, one tucked against the base of the lamp in the living room where it would definitely be found, but could also be explained as accidental. His son, at 5 years old, was marking territory with crayon art. A drawing of the three of them at the park. A drawing of what appeared to be Gerald the elephant meeting a figure labeled Re-Ina in careful block letters. A drawing of the house from the outside with smoke coming from the chimney, which struck Landon as pointed since Serena's house did not have a working chimney. She kept every one of them. He knew because he saw them. First on the refrigerator, then, after a few weeks, framed, properly framed, not in cheap plastic, but in actual frames that matched the walls, hanging in the hallway near the kitchen. He didn't say anything about it. She didn't either. But he stood in that hallway one evening while Mason was in the other room insisting on showing Serena something on his preschool iPad. and he looked at his son's drawings hanging on the wall of a house that had been closed and silent for years and felt something in his chest move in a way that he couldn't entirely control and didn't try to. November came. The city got colder. The Thursdays at the cafe became Wednesday evenings at her house more often than not. The three of them settled into her large living room with the television on something Mason had chosen, usually involving animated animals with strong opinions, while Serena graded nothing and reviewed nothing and did the radical thing of simply sitting still, which Landon understood cost her more effort than running a board meeting. He was beginning to understand her. Not completely. She was not a person you understood completely. There were rooms in her he hadn't been inside, probably rooms she hadn't been inside herself, but in the way that mattered. He knew she ordered the same thing every time at the cafe because making small decisions tired her, all her decision-making energy going toward the large ones. He knew she hated the phone but would answer a text within 3 minutes. He knew that when she was stressed, she reorganized things. Her desk, her kitchen cabinets, once the entire living room while he and Mason were there, shifting furniture with brisk efficiency until the room made more sense to her, then stopping and looking around with the particular satisfaction of someone who had solved the problem that was available to be solved. He knew that some Tuesdays were worse than others. He didn't ask which ones. She didn't explain. They had their own private calendars of difficult days, and they'd both learned not to demand accounting for them. What he did not know, what neither of them had addressed with any honesty, was where this was going. Whether it was going anywhere. Whether going somewhere was even a concept that applied to two people who had both built their lives around the premise that the people they'd loved most were gone, and that was the permanent fact around which everything else was arranged. He thought about it. He thought about it at night in the apartment, and he thought about it on his drives to work. And once he thought about it so hard during a budget review that his department head had to say his name twice. He had not yet found an answer, but he had begun to notice, with a low and somewhat alarming frequency, that when Serena laughed, he remembered what it felt like to want something for himself rather than just for Mason. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that. He put it with the other hot things he was waiting until he could handle. Buzz. The call came on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November. Landon was at his desk reviewing a variance report when his phone buzzed with a message from Serena. "Something happened. Can you talk tonight?" He replied immediately, "Yes. Your place or mine?" "Mine. Come at 7 if you can." He came at 7. Mason was with Mrs. Okafor. Serena opened the door and she was still in work clothes, late in the evening, still in full armor, and her expression had a tightness to it he recognized as the load-bearing face, the one she wore when she was holding something heavy and needed to keep holding it a while longer before she could set it down. She poured them both whiskey without asking. He didn't usually drink whiskey, but he took the glass. "His name is Warren Cole," she said, sitting down across from him. "He was Daniel's best friend. They grew up together. He was the best man at our wedding." She held her glass but didn't drink from it. After the accident, after Daniel and Ivy died, Warren decided that it was my fault. Landon kept his face still and waited. He never said it directly. At first, he just stopped calling, stopped being around. I thought it was grief. I thought we were all just surviving. But then I started hearing things. Comments to mutual friends, the idea circulating in Daniel's family that I had been neglectful, that I had chosen my career over my family, and that choice had consequences. She finally drank. It didn't get loud for a while. I moved, I changed jobs, I built Vantara from 30 people to 700, and the distance helped. But Warren never stopped. What did he do? Enough. Enough to make sure that in certain circles, certain professional circles, my name came with a footnote. Nothing provable, nothing I could address directly. Just presence, a whisper campaign, run slowly, over years. She set the glass down. And now he's turned it up. What happened? He contacted 3 members of my board separately this week. Her voice stayed level with visible effort. He told them I was emotionally unstable, that my grief had never been properly addressed, and that it was affecting my judgment. He cited my personal life, as evidence of professional unfitness. Landon felt something cold move through him. What personal life? Us. She met his eyes. Someone at the company has been talking. I don't know who. Warren found out about the coffees, about the park, about you and Mason coming here. She paused. He framed it as, he told the board that I was developing an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate and that it demonstrated poor judgment. The room was quiet for a moment. Serena, I'm not done. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. 2 of the 3 board members he contacted have requested a formal meeting, a review of my recent decisions. There are words like concerned and comprehensive assessment in the email. She looked at him. It's a play. It's a structured play to remove me from the company I built, and it has Warren's fingerprints all over it. Landon set down his glass. He thought about what to say and discarded 3 versions of it before speaking. What can I do? Nothing right now. She sat back. I needed to tell you because you're involved and you deserved to know. And because... She stopped and the controlled surface slipped just slightly. Because I'm angry and I'm scared and I didn't want to be alone with both of those things tonight. Okay, he said. Then I'm here. I don't need you to fix it. I know. I don't need you to tell me it'll be fine. I wasn't going to. She looked at him. The tightness in her face was still there, but something behind it shifted, some small increment of pressure releasing. Okay, she said. Tell me about Warren, he said. Not the campaign, him. Tell me who he actually is. She was quiet for a moment, and then she started talking. She told him about the Warren she'd known when Daniel was alive. She'd sharp and loyal and genuinely funny. Someone who made Daniel better because he was one of the only people who could tell Daniel when he was wrong and make him laugh at the same time. She told him about the Warren at the funeral who had held her hand during the service and said, "We'll get through this," and meant it. And she told him about the moment, a dinner, 8 months after the accident, the first time she'd seen him since, when something had changed. When he'd looked at her across the table and she'd seen something in his face that was past grief and into something harder. You're still here, his eyes had said, without words. You're still here and they're not. He needed someone to blame, Landon said. Yes, because grief without a target is just grief, and that's harder to carry. Yes. She looked at her hands, and I was there, and I had said no when Daniel asked me to take Ivy to gymnastics that morning, and Warren knew that. Did Daniel tell him? I don't know, maybe. Or maybe Warren just knew me well enough to know what I would have done, what I always did. She said it without flinching. I worked. That was what I did. They both knew it. That's not the same as fault, Landon said. No, she said, but it gave him a shape for his grief, and he's been building on that shape for 6 years. Landon thought about this. He thought about the specific cruelty of it. Not dramatic cruelty, not the kind that happened in movies, but the slow grinding kind that arrived as whispers and HR emails and careful questions from board members. The kind that cost you things over time without a single moment you could point to and say, there, that's where it happened. What does the board actually have power to do? He said. They can call a confidence vote. If enough members move on it, they can put my position to a formal review. She picked up her glass again. I have allies on the board. I'm not without allies. But I also need to understand exactly what Warren told them, and I need to be prepared to respond to it directly. And I need to do all of that without it looking like I'm scrambling, because the moment I look like I'm scrambling, the narrative writes itself. What's the narrative? She looked at him steadily. Emotional woman in over her head, grief finally catching up with her, poor judgment in her personal life bleeding into her professional one. A pause. The story writes itself, and it writes itself in a way that has nothing to do with my actual work or my actual record. Then your actual record is what you use, he said. It's the only argument that cuts through the story they're trying to tell. I know. She sounded tired. I know that. I've been building this company for 7 years, and I know exactly how to defend it. I know every number and every decision and every moment where I chose the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong one. She set down the glass for the last time. I'm tired of having to. He didn't have an answer for that. That was an honest thing, and honest things didn't always have answers. "I know," he said. He drove home through November streets with his hands at 10 and 2 and thought about Serena's face when she'd said, "I'm scared." Not ashamed of saying it, not performing vulnerability, just stating a fact about her current internal state the way she stated everything, directly and without decoration. It had taken him 3 coffees and several weeks to get there himself, and she'd done it in the second glass of whiskey, and he'd felt the specific weight of what it cost her. He also thought about Warren Cole, about the mechanism of what Warren was doing, weaponizing someone's grief against them, using the private architecture of loss as ammunition in a professional battle. It was cold in a way that made Landon's jaw tight. Not hot anger, cold anger, the kind that sits still and thinks. And underneath all of that, running quiet and persistent like a signal on a frequency he hadn't tuned to deliberately, the fact that what they were doing, the Thursdays, the park, the evenings in her living room, Mason's drawings on her wall, had now been seen. Named, used. It had crossed from their private world into the public one, and the public one had an opinion about it, and the opinion had already started moving. He thought about Mason, asleep upstairs when he got home. He thought about what it meant to have let something grow without deciding to, and about what happened to things that grew without being decided on when the world took notice of them. He sat in the parking garage for exactly 11 minutes. Then he went upstairs, kissed his sleeping son on the forehead, and lay in bed looking at the ceiling for a long time. The board meeting request arrived in Serena's email on a Friday. Formal, correct, signed by the board chair with the specific corporate politeness that meant the situation was serious. A special session 2 weeks out. She was expected to present. The language around it was careful, all professionalism and concern, but Serena had been reading corporate language long enough to hear what it actually said. "We've heard something and we need to be managed." She forwarded it to Landon with no message. He replied, "I'll be there if you need me to be." She replied, "You can't come to the board meeting." He replied, "I didn't say the board meeting." She didn't respond to that for 4 hours. Then, "Okay." He didn't know what he was promising exactly. He just knew he'd meant it, and she'd understood it, and they both knew the other understood, which was enough for now. What happened next, he didn't anticipate. On Monday morning, he arrived at his desk to find a voicemail from an unknown number. The kind of unknown number that turns out to be a journalist, which this one did. A woman from the Carver City Business Review who had apparently been fed a tip about a senior executive's personal conduct and was reaching out to all relevant parties for comment. She left her name and number with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had done this many times and found it professionally interesting. Landon stared at his phone. He did not call back. He went straight to Serena's office, not the 42nd floor this time with the wrong pretense, but directly, through the assistant who knew him now and nodded him through, and found her already on the phone, her expression the winter version, the one that had no temperature at all. She held up one finger without looking at him. He sat. She finished the call, brief, clipped, telling someone he couldn't identify that she understood the situation and would be in touch, and set the phone down. "He talked to the press," Landon said. "Not directly. He doesn't do anything directly. But yes, someone did." She looked at her desk as though it had personally failed her. "The Business Review, and probably 2 others by end of week. What does that do to the board situation?" "Complicates it. If there's press coverage before the meeting, the board members who might have stayed neutral will feel pressure to be seen as taking it seriously." She picked up a pen and put it down again, the reorganizing impulse finding the only available outlet. "It's not a killing blow. It could have been smarter. Warren is angrier than he is strategic these days, which is actually, that's his weakness. Angry people make moves ahead of the optimal time. So you can use that. Maybe, if I move correctly." She looked at him. "Landon, what happened with the journalist call?" "I got a voicemail. I didn't call back. I came here instead." "Don't call back. Don't comment to anyone, not colleagues, no one. The story they're trying to build needs your voice in it to have texture. You don't give them your voice." "Okay. I mean it." "I know you mean it." She held his gaze for a moment, and then something shifted in her face. Not the professional mask cracking, more like the volume in the room dropping, the emergency frequency giving way briefly to something quieter underneath. "Are you okay?" she said. The question surprised him, that she was asking him, in the middle of her own professional crisis, whether he was okay. "I'm fine," he said. And then, because she'd earned honesty, and they were past the version of things where he gave her the automatic answer, "I'm worried about you, and I'm worried about what this means for what we've been building. Whatever we've been building." She was quiet for a moment. "What have we been building?" she said. It wasn't a challenge, it was a genuine question, asked the way she asked things, directly, without softening, because she wanted an actual answer and not a comfortable deflection. Landon thought about Saturday mornings. He thought about Mason's drawings in frames on her hallway wall. He thought about a woman spinning on playground equipment with her green coat fanning out and a laugh coming loose from somewhere deep. He thought about sitting across from her in the cafe at 7:15 in the morning while the city came to life outside and talking about things he hadn't said out loud to anyone in 2 years. "Something worth protecting," he said. She held his gaze. Outside her office, the 42nd floor went about its business. Phones and keyboards and the muffled ordinary noise of 700 people working inside a company she had built. And inside the office, 2 people looked at each other with the full weight of what they hadn't said yet and found that the weight was bearable. "Okay," she said. Her version of yes. Her version of me, too. "Okay," he said back. On that evening, Tuesday, Landon did not go up to the 42nd floor. He stayed at his desk and worked until 8, and then took the elevator straight to the garage. But as he pulled out of the parking structure and turned onto the street, his phone lit up with a text from Serena. He stopped at the light and read it. "I opened the door tonight. The one at the end of the upstairs hall. I've been keeping it closed for 6 years. I just stood there. Didn't go in. Just stood there." He read it twice. He thought about a small cloud-shaped nightlight on a shelf, not plugged in. He pulled over on Mercer Street, engine running, and typed back, "That's not nothing. That's actually enormous." The response came after a minute. It didn't feel enormous. It just felt like standing in a hallway. He stared at that for a while. He thought about how most of the things that changed the direction of a life didn't feel enormous when they were happening. They felt like standing in a hallway, or eating a birthday cake at midnight, or hearing music from behind a door that hadn't latched properly. "Yeah," he typed back. "That's usually how it starts." He sat there on Mercer Street with the engine running and the city moving past him on both sides, and felt the careful, frightened, determined shape of what they were becoming. Both of them holding more than they could comfortably carry. Both of them still standing. Both of them beginning, in their separate ways, to turn toward the closed doors instead of away from them. It wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. It was 2 people with damage who kept choosing, one small decision at a time, to not let the damage be the final word. And something in the world had noticed and decided to test whether they meant it. The testing, Landon understood sitting on Mercer Street, had barely begun. The 2 weeks before the board meeting were the longest Landon could remember since the weeks after Claire died. The same quality of time, stretched and dense, every day carrying more weight than a day should reasonably be asked to carry. He went to work. He came home. He made dinner for Mason and helped him with the preschool projects that arrived with the cheerful chaos of a 5-year-old's creative vision. One week a collage requiring 17 different colors of paper, the next a model of something Mason called a rock museum, which was exactly what it sounded like. He did all the ordinary things, and underneath all of them ran the steady current of waiting. Serena was preparing. He understood what that meant in practice because he saw it. Not all of it. She was too controlled for that. But enough. She was at the office before 7 every morning and rarely left before 9 at night. She had meetings he wasn't part of, conversations with lawyers and board allies and her CFO who had apparently made it quietly clear that if the board moved against Serena, he would follow her out the door, which was the kind of loyalty that came from 7 years of someone trusting you with actual authority. She was building her case with the same focused precision she brought to everything, and Landon stayed out of her way and let her build it. What she let him see was smaller. A text at 10 at night. Found a board email from 2019 where I called Warren Cole a brilliant strategic thinker in the context of a potential consulting arrangement. I'm going to use it. He'd replied, "That's cold." She'd replied, "He started it." He'd found himself smiling at his phone in the dark of his apartment and had to think about that for a minute. He thought about a lot of things in those 2 weeks. Most of them circled back to the same place, what he'd said to her in her office when she'd asked him what they were building. Something worth protecting. He'd meant it. He still meant it. But meaning something and knowing what to do with it were not the same, and he was becoming aware with increasing clarity that at some point he was going to have to do something with it rather than just mean it. He had not told Claire's parents about Serena. He hadn't told anyone about Serena, technically, but Claire's parents, her mother Donna, who called every Sunday to talk to Mason, her father Ray, who came up from Millfield twice a year and took Mason to the Children's Museum, and always brought Landon a six-pack and sat in the kitchen making careful conversation about baseball, were the specific people he thought about when he thought about what it would mean to say this out loud. They were good people. They adored Mason. They had never been anything but kind to Landon since their daughter died, and he knew, in the part of him that sat with uncomfortable truths, that he was afraid of their reaction. Not afraid enough to stay silent forever, just afraid enough to have been staying silent. He talked to Claire about it. Not out loud. He wasn't there yet, and wasn't sure he'd get there. But in the private internal way he'd been doing since she died, the running conversation with her that was really a conversation with himself, with his own knowledge of who she had been. He sat on the edge of their old bed. His bed now had been his bed for 2 years, but the word "our" still surfaced sometimes, and thought about what she would have said. She would have asked him if he was happy. She would have meant it genuinely, and she would have known from his face whether he was lying. She had always known from his face. He thought that he was getting there, that he was in the territory adjacent to happy, which was as close as he'd been in 2 years, and that it frightened him, and that she would have told him the fear was reasonable, and also that it wasn't a stop sign. She would have liked Serena, he thought. Not easily. Claire had a specific kind of wariness with people who held their cards too close, and Serena held her entire hand against her chest, but eventually, after she'd earned it. He sat with that for a while and then went to check on Mason and found him sound asleep with Gerald the elephant tucked firmly under one arm and a library book about ocean animals open on his chest, which meant he'd fallen asleep mid-page, which meant tomorrow morning's argument about finishing the chapter before school was going to be spirited. Landon put the book on the nightstand and turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'm doing okay," he said quietly, to the room, to the idea of Claire, to himself. "I think I'm doing okay." The board meeting was on a Thursday. He was not there. He was at his desk on the 39th floor doing his job, which was what she had asked him to do, and what he was doing with the specific focused discipline of a person who has made a promise and intends to keep it. At 11:43, his phone buzzed. The message was 2 words, "Going in." He sent back a single period. Their shorthand by now for "I'm here." He didn't hear from her until 2:17 in the afternoon. He had accomplished approximately 40% of his normal productivity in that time and had refilled his coffee cup 4 times and had a conversation with a colleague about quarterly depreciation schedules that he would not have been able to recall 5 minutes later. The message at 2:17 said, "Done. My office. When you can." He was on the elevator 45 seconds later. She was standing at her windows when he came in. Not the dark office this time. The afternoon light full and gray through the glass. The city laid out below in the flat November light. She turned when she heard him close the door. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had spent 3 hours in a room being carefully, professionally doubted, and had answered every question with precision and left nothing on the table. She also looked like she'd won. "Tell me," he said. I presented 7 years of performance data, margin growth, retention numbers, the expansion into the Western markets last year, the risk management framework we built in 2022 that 3 other firms have since adopted as industry standard. She moved to her desk, not to sit, but just to have something solid near her. I addressed Warren's characterization directly. I did not get emotional. I did not defend my grief. I defended my record because my record is not disputable, and I let the record make the argument that his campaign against me has always been personal and has never had anything to do with my fitness as a CEO. And the board? Margolis and Chen the two he got to first. They were the question marks going in. Margolis asked me 3-pointed questions about the personal conduct issue. She said the phrase with the specific dryness of someone who found it both offensive and slightly absurd. I told him that my personal relationships were my own business, that none of them had produced a conflict of interest or affected any professional decision, and that if the board wanted to establish a precedent of reviewing executives' personal lives, I'd be interested to see that policy applied uniformly. A pause. He didn't ask a fourth question. Landon almost smiled. And Chen? Chen cares about one thing, the stock price. I showed him a projection. He was fine. She sat down finally, in the sideways position, the not quite formal one. The confidence vote isn't happening. Warren doesn't have the numbers, and he won't get them. The chair told me afterward, privately, that the board considers the matter closed. Okay, Landon said. That's good. That's really good. Yes. She looked at her desk. It is. She didn't look as relieved as she should have. He let the silence sit for a moment. What else? He said. She looked up. Warren called me this morning. Before the meeting, I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. She paused. He said he hoped I was proud of what I'd done. He said Daniel would have been ashamed of me for moving on, for... She stopped briefly. He said I was replacing them. Replacing Daniel and Ivy like they were things I'd lost that could be swapped out. The room was very quiet. Landon pulled the chair close to her desk and sat in it. That's not what you're doing. I know that. Does knowing it make it not land? No, she said. It lands anyway. She put both hands flat on the desk, the self-steadying gesture. He's been carrying Daniel's memory like a weapon for 6 years and pointing it at me. And I've spent 6 years half believing he's right to, and... She stopped. The board thing I can handle. I handled it today. Warren saying that in a voicemail I listened to at 6 in the morning is a different thing. You need to talk to him, Landon said. She looked at him. Not for him, Landon said. He doesn't deserve a conversation. I mean, you need to close it for yourself. You've been letting him define what your grief is supposed to look like and what you're allowed to do with your life, and you need to take that back from him. I know. Do you want to? A pause, long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, I'm scared of what he'll say. I'll be with you, Landon said. Not in the room, but after. Whatever he says, I'll be there after. She looked at him for a moment with the expression that wasn't assessment, wasn't professionalism, wasn't the careful management of what she let be seen. Just Serena. Just a person who had been carrying something alone for a very long time, being offered a hand. Okay, she said. She met Warren Cole 4 days later on a Sunday at a coffee place in the Garfield district that was neutral ground. Not her neighborhood, not his, not a place either of them had history. Landon dropped her off and sat in the car 2 blocks away and waited, which was the hardest thing he'd done in a while. She was in there for an hour and 20 minutes. When she came back to the car, she got in and closed the door and sat for a moment without speaking. Her face was unreadable in the way that came from having felt everything in rapid succession and arrived at a place past the weather of it. He cried, she said finally. Landon hadn't expected that. He didn't start that way. He started angry. He said everything he'd been building up to say, all the things from the voicemail, and worse, the things he'd been holding for 6 years. She looked at the windshield. And I let him. I didn't interrupt. I let him say everything. And when he was finished, I said, I know you loved Daniel. I know you loved Ivy. I loved them more than you did, and I have to live with losing them every day, and I will until I die. And I am not replacing them. I am surviving. And I needed you to tell me to my face whether you believe I caused this, because I've been carrying your blame on top of my own for 6 years, and I'm done carrying it. What did he say? She was quiet for a moment. He said no. He said he knew it wasn't my fault. He said he'd always known. He said he'd needed it to be someone's fault, and I was there, and I let him. Her voice was steady but tight at the edges. And then he cried. And I didn't hug him. I wanted to, maybe, because he was Daniel's person, and some part of me still connects him to Daniel. But I didn't. That's okay. I know. She turned to look at him. I told him I forgave him. Not for him. Because I've been carrying his version of me for 6 years, and I don't want to carry it anymore. She paused. I don't know if we'll ever speak again. Probably not. But it's done. It actually feels done. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the seat. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat in the car in the Garfield district on a gray Sunday with the engine off, and he felt the exact weight of what had just shifted. Not everything, not a resolution of all things, but something structural. Something load-bearing that had been in the wrong place for years and had finally been moved. Let's go get Mason, she said after a while. Yeah, he said. Let's go get him. The Sunday after that, Serena called Landon at 9 in the morning and said, I need you to come over, both of you, today. There was something in her voice that wasn't distress but was serious. He said okay. He told Mason they were going to Rena's, and Mason accepted this with the complete unsurprise of someone who had long since filed Rena under regular part of life. When they got there, she was waiting by the front door in jeans and a worn sweatshirt, the least corporate he'd ever seen her. And she looked like someone who had made a decision and was standing in the moment before acting on it, which was a specific kind of look, the kind that meant the deciding was done, and now came the doing. What's going on? Landon said. She didn't answer. She looked at Mason, who was looking around the entryway with the evaluating interest of a person who had visited many times and still found things worth noticing. Mason, she said, do you want to help me with something today? What kind of something? Mason said, which was, Landon had learned, his way of saying yes while maintaining the right to negotiate. There's a room upstairs that's been closed for a long time, she said, and I'd like to open it today, and I think I'd like some company. Mason looked at her with 5-year-old directness. Why has it been closed? Because someone I loved used to be in it, and after she was gone, I didn't know what to do with it. She said it simply, without dressing it up. Her name was Ivy. She was 4 years old, and she was very funny, and she liked spinning in circles. Mason thought about this seriously. I like spinning in circles. I know, Serena said. That's part of why I wanted you here. Landon watched his son reach up and take Serena's hand the way he'd done at the park. No preamble, no performance, just the direct physical logic of a child who had decided someone needed his hand, and so he gave it. Okay, Mason said. Let's open it. Patam. The door was at the end of the upstairs hall. White painted wood, same as the others. A small purple star sticker on the upper left corner that no one had ever removed. Landon stood slightly behind them as Serena and Mason stood in front of it, Serena's hand on the knob. She opened it. The room had been preserved, not in a shrine-like way, not the extreme kind, but just as it had been. A small bed with a purple comforter. A bookshelf at child height with picture books still in their places. A soft rug in the shape of a turtle. On the shelf above the window, a cloud-shaped nightlight, which Landon recognized and felt land in his chest. The room smelled like time, like the specific stillness of a closed space, like something that had been waiting. Serena stood in the doorway for a long moment. She didn't cry. She just stood there and looked at it with an expression he couldn't fully read. Grief, and something past grief, someplace you arrived at on the other side of the worst part of it. He put his hand on her back, between her shoulder blades, and she leaned into it slightly. Mason let go of her hand and walked into the room. He stood on the turtle rug and looked around with careful interest. He looked at the bookshelf. He looked at the cloud nightlight. He looked at the purple comforter on the small bed. She had good books, he said, reading the spines with the focused intensity of someone recently learning to read and applying the skill constantly. She did, Serena said. Her voice came out even. Can I look at one? Yes. Mason pulled out a book, a picture book about a bear who couldn't sleep and kept finding reasons to stay up, and sat down cross-legged on the turtle rug and opened it. He didn't ask for permission to sit there. He just sat there, comfortable and present, the way he was present everywhere, and began sounding out words. Landon watched Serena watch his son sitting on her daughter's rug, reading her daughter's book, and he saw the exact moment something in her face gave way. Not collapsed, not broke, but gave way the way a door gives way when you stop holding it shut. Tears came and she let them, without covering her face or turning away. She stood in the doorway of the room that had been closed for 6 years and cried quietly and let it happen. He stood beside her and didn't say anything and didn't move away. Mason read 2 pages and looked up. He looked at Serena and at the tears on her face and made the evaluation that 5-year-olds make when they see an adult crying. Rapid, practical, compassionate. "It's okay to be sad," he told her. "My dad cries sometimes too." "Does he?" Serena said. "Yes. He thinks I'm asleep, but I hear him sometimes." Mason delivered this information without accusation, just as fact. He says it's okay to be sad as long as you also eat dinner. Serena made a sound that was crying and laughing at the same time, the uncontrolled kind, the kind that surprised her. Landon felt it happen and felt something in his own chest loosen in response. "That's good advice," she managed. "He has good advice sometimes," Mason said charitably, and went back to the book. Voces. They spent 3 hours in that room. Not cleaning it out. That was not the right word for what happened. Going through it. Serena went through Ivy's things with her hands and her memory, holding each object for a moment before deciding. Some things she set in a box she labeled carefully with a marker in her precise left-leaning handwriting, things she needed to keep, not because she needed to see them every day, but because they were Ivy's and she wasn't ready and might never be, and that was allowed. A small pair of shoes. A drawing Ivy had made that was mostly scribble with 2 figures labeled in adult handwriting, me and Mama. The cloud nightlight, which she wrapped carefully in a sweater from the closet. Other things she set aside for a children's shelter 2 miles from her house. Books, the soft toys, the turtle rug after she sat on it herself for a while, and told Landon and Mason, without being asked, about the afternoon she and Daniel had bought it at a street market, and Ivy had insisted on carrying it home herself, even though it was almost as big as she was. She had dragged it down 6 blocks and fallen twice, and got back up both times and refused all offers of help. "That's a good story," Mason said. "Yes," Serena said. She was like that. By the time they finished, the December light was already fading from gray to dark at the window, and Mason had fallen asleep on Serena's lap on the floor of the room, heavy and limp in the specific way of a sleeping child. Gerald the elephant, having arrived from the bag Landon had brought. Serena sat with her back against the wall, and her hand resting on Mason's hair, and looked at the room that was no longer the same as it had been when they'd opened the door. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being here for this." "I didn't do anything," Landon said. He was sitting across from her, his back against the small bookshelf. "You were here." She looked down at Mason. "You both were." He looked at his son asleep on Serena's lap. He thought about Claire and about Ivy and about Daniel and about the strange and non-linear way that life moved forward even when you had decided it wasn't allowed to. He thought about how love and grief were not opposites, how they lived in the same space and fed from the same place, and how you didn't choose one or the other, you carried both. He had spent 2 years believing that moving forward was the same as leaving Claire behind, that each day he functioned was a day he'd accepted her absence, and accepting her absence was a kind of betrayal. He understood now, sitting on the floor of Ivy's room with his son asleep between them, that he'd had it wrong. She wasn't being left. She was being carried. She went with him the same way Daniel and Ivy went with Serena, in the specific knowledge they'd left behind, in the habits they'd formed around each other, in Mason's eyelashes and the birthday cake recipe and the long route home on Tuesdays. "I've been thinking about something," he said. Serena looked at him. "About what we're doing. About what I want." He said it carefully, because these were not words he'd assembled for a speech. They were just the true ones. "I spent 2 years thinking that staying stuck was the same as being loyal to Claire. And I think I've been wrong about that for a while, but I didn't know how to say it." She was very still. "I don't know exactly what comes next," he said. I don't have a plan. But I know that being here with you and Mason, this is real. And I want it to keep being real. Not because I've stopped loving her or because I'm trying to replace what I had, but because I think she would have wanted me to find my way back to something like this. And I think I have." The room was quiet. Mason breathed the deep, even breath of the completely asleep. "I want that too," Serena said. "I've wanted it for a while, and I've been afraid of what wanting it meant. If it meant I was done grieving. If being happy again was the same as saying they didn't matter." She looked at the nearly empty bookshelf. "But they're not going anywhere. I'm keeping them. I'm just also keeping this." "Yes," Landon said. "That's exactly it." She looked across at him in the dark room, and he looked back, and what passed between them was not a dramatic thing. It was quiet and private and had no audience. It was just two people who had each learned the weight of loss deciding, without theater, that they were willing to try for something else, not instead of what they'd lost, but alongside it. Outside, Carver City moved through its December evening, indifferent as always. All lights and noise, and the ordinary, relentless forward motion of the world. Inside the room, a man and a woman sat on either side of a sleeping child, and understood that the work of healing was not arriving at a place where it didn't hurt anymore. It was learning to carry the hurt without letting it be the only thing you carried. They stayed on the floor until Mason stirred and woke and looked around with the confused assessment of a child reconstructing where he was. "Are we still at Rena's?" he said. "We're still at Rena's," Landon said. Mason settled back against Serena's side with the complete confidence of a person who had established that this was a perfectly acceptable place to be. "Good," he said, and closed his eyes again. Serena looked at Landon over his head, and for the first time in a long time, maybe the first time since before all of it, before the accident and the silence and the 6 years of carrying this alone, she looked like someone who believed that what came next might actually be worth the wait of getting there. The weeks after Ivy's room were different, not transformed. Nothing happened that cleanly, and both of them had been through enough to know that real change didn't arrive like weather, all at once and undeniable. It arrived the way everything real arrived, incrementally, quietly, in the accumulated weight of small moments you didn't notice until you looked back at them from a distance and understood that somewhere in there the ground had shifted under your feet without announcing itself. What was different was a quality of permission. Like two people who had been holding their breath for a long time had finally, not all at once but gradually, started to breathe normally again. Serena stopped keeping her coat on at the cafe. It was a small thing. Landon noticed it on the first Thursday in December and didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. The coat had always been the last armor, the thing she kept on even after the conversation had gone deep and real, as though she needed to preserve the option of having somewhere else to be. Now it went over the back of the chair when she sat down, and she didn't seem to notice the difference. And that was exactly how it should be. Mason noticed everything, of course. Mason was 5 and had the comprehensive observational database of someone who had been taking inventory of his world since birth and filing the data with unusual precision. He noticed that when Landon and Serena sat next to each other on her couch now, the distance between them was different. He didn't comment on this directly. He was 5, not 16. But he did begin, with the quiet strategic certainty of a small person who had decided something, to always sit somewhere other than between them. He sat on the floor. He sat in the armchair. He sat at the coffee table with his drawings, keeping his back to the couch with the focused concentration of a person who was very busy and definitely not engineering the seating arrangement. Landon caught Serena's eye over Mason's head one evening, and she had the expression of someone trying very hard not to smile. He had that expression back at her. They were being outmaneuvered by a kindergartner, and they both knew it, and there was nothing dignified to do about it. December moved forward the way December does, with its particular compressed quality, days shorter, and everything somehow more urgent, the city strung with lights, and the cold arriving in earnest. Mason had a preschool holiday performance in the second week of the month, a 12-minute musical event involving 17 children, a song about winter animals, and several moments of complete improvisational chaos that the teachers were clearly framing as intentional. Landon was in the third row. Serena was next to him. She had asked, the week before, if it would be okay to come. She'd asked carefully, in the way she asked things that mattered to her, directly but with a quality of genuine uncertainty underneath, not performing unsureness but actually feeling it. He'd said yes without hesitation, and she'd nodded and said okay, and then very deliberately changed the subject because she still did that sometimes. Said the real thing and then moved away from it quickly, like touching something hot and pulling back. She sat next to him in the folding chair in the preschool gymnasium and watched Mason, who had been assigned the role of Winter Fox and was executing the choreography with the absolute physical commitment of a person who had practiced this and intended to be remembered for it. And Landon watched her watching Mason, and what he saw on her face was something he didn't have a word for. Not sadness, or not only sadness, something more complex than that. The way a scar can ache in cold weather. Not because it's reopening, but because it remembers. She had a photo of Ivy on her phone. She'd shown it to him once, just once, a few weeks ago, late at night in her kitchen over the last of a bottle of wine. A little girl with Serena's eyes and dark hair and two uneven pigtails, squinting into the camera with an expression of extreme suspicion at whoever was taking the picture. Alive and specific and individual in the way photographs of children always were. The particular personhood of them impossible to reduce to the fact of their absence. Landon had looked at the photo for a moment and then looked at Serena and said, "She looks like she had opinions." And Serena had laughed, a real laugh, the loose kind, and said, "She had opinions about everything. She told a grocery store clerk that the apples were in the wrong place. She was 3. He thought about that now. Watching Serena watch his son perform the Winter Fox choreography with full dramatic investment. He thought about all the things she'd missed, all the school performances and park mornings and pancake arguments and ordinary weekday evenings that she'd been supposed to have and didn't. He didn't try to think past that. There was no thinking past that. There was only sitting with it and letting it be true without letting it be the only true thing. When Mason spotted them from the stage, the moment the children were released from formation and encouraged to find their families, he came at full speed across the gymnasium floor with his fox ears headband askew and launched himself at Landon first, then turned with zero hesitation and reached his arms up toward Serena. She caught him. She held him with her arms around his small back, and her eyes closed for a second, and then she opened them, and Landon was looking at her. And she looked back at him over the top of Mason's head, and she looked wrecked a little. The good kind of wrecked. The kind that came from being broken open by something tender rather than something terrible. "I was the best fox," Mason announced. "You were absolutely the best fox," she said. "Don't tell Tyler I said that." "I won't." He squirmed down and went looking for the juice boxes being distributed near the gymnasium door, and Serena stood and straightened and looked at Landon, and he looked back, and neither of them needed to say what that had been. "Are you okay?" he said. "I will be," she said, which was more honest than yes and more hopeful than no, and exactly the right answer. He called Donna and Ray in the first week of January. He'd been building up to it since November, which meant he'd been not calling them since November, and he'd had enough conversations with himself about it to understand that the not calling was its own answer, and the longer he waited, the more weight the call acquired, and the only real option was to just do it. He called Ray first. Ray was more direct. Ray had less surface area for things to get complicated on. He called on a Sunday evening while Mason was at a neighbor's birthday party, his first real solo social event, which he'd been extremely serious about preparing for, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold and his phone in his hand. Ray answered on the third ring. "Hey, Landon, everything okay? Mason all right?" "Everyone's fine," Landon said. I wanted to talk to you about something, not emergency something, just something." A pause on Ray's end. The particular quality of a father's pause when he's adjusting from alarm to attention. "Okay, I'm listening," Landon told him. He didn't dress it up. He said there was someone, that it had been several months, that it was real and was becoming more real, and he wanted Ray and Donna to know before it became the kind of thing they found out about indirectly. He said her name. He said she was Mason's friend, had been for months, that Mason had chosen her before Landon had fully admitted to himself that he had. Ray was quiet for a long moment. "Is she good to him?" he said finally. "To Mason." "Yes." No hesitation on that one. Yes, she's very good to him." Another pause. Landon turned the cold coffee cup in circles on the table. Are you happy, son? Ray said. The word son hit Landon somewhere unexpected. Ray had called him that since early in his relationship with Claire, matter-of-factly, without making a ceremony of it, and he'd never stopped after she died. Landon had never asked him to. I'm getting there, Landon said. I think I'm actually getting there. Ray exhaled a long breath, the kind that carried a lot of weight out with it. Claire wanted that for you, he said. I want you to know that. We talked about it, her and me, after you two were married, the way parents talk about things they don't want to say out loud. She said if anything ever happened to her, she didn't want you to spend your life in it. She said Mason needed his dad present, not preserved. A pause. She was always smarter than me about things like that. Landon's throat was tight. He didn't try to talk until it wasn't. Thank you, he managed. Bring her to Millfield sometime, Ray said. Let us meet her. Donna's going to want to meet her. Donna's going to have questions. Donna's going to have 30 questions, Ray said. That's just Donna. You know that. Landon laughed, and it was real, and the tight thing in his throat loosened. I know that. You're doing right by him, Landon. You've been doing right by him since day one. Ray's voice was gruff and certain, the way men of his generation could be certain. That's all I need to know. After he hung up, Landon sat at the kitchen table for a while with his cold coffee and felt the specific combination of grief and gratitude that seemed to accompany every real thing in his life, the way the two were always present together, always mixed, impossible to feel one without the trace of the other. He thought about Claire saying Mason needs his dad present, not preserved. He thought about how well she'd known him, how she'd understood him past the places he understood himself. He picked up his phone and texted Serena, called Ray. It went okay. Better than okay. She replied in 2 minutes. I'm glad. Then, are you okay? He thought about it honestly. Yeah, a little undone, but okay. She sent back a single period. I'm here. He smiled at his phone and went to pick up his son from the birthday party. Ivy's room became something else in February. Not erased. That was the wrong word and the wrong idea, and Serena had been clear about that with herself from the beginning of thinking about it. The things that needed to be kept were kept. In the careful box in the closet of the master bedroom, in the framed photo on Serena's nightstand, in the cloud nightlight that she had plugged in on the first night after they'd opened the room and left glowing on the shelf because it turned out the room needed light in it. Not a lot. Just enough. The transformation of the room was gradual and took 3 weekends and involved a level of disagreement between Landon and Serena about paint color that neither of them had anticipated. It should be warm, Serena said. Something warm. That's not a color, that's a temperature. You know what I mean. I know what you mean, and I'm telling you that the thing you're holding up is orange. That's orange. That's going to look like a traffic cone. It's terracotta. It's an orange traffic cone with a fancy name. Mason, who had been given the serious commission of official paint sample consultant and was taking it extremely seriously, held up a card labeled warm linen and said, This one. They both looked at it. That's the one, Serena said. Yeah, Landon said, that's the one. Mason looked deeply satisfied. He put the terracotta card down with the decisive motion of a man who had made an executive decision and was prepared to stand by it. The room became a reading room, bookshelves, proper ones, floor to ceiling on one wall, built by a carpenter Serena hired and supervised with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting to put something in this space for a long time and needed it done right. A window seat along the wall with the best light, cushioned in a fabric that Mason had also selected, and that Landon privately thought was a slightly alarming shade of green, but which somehow worked. A small lamp in the corner, the cloud nightlight still on its shelf, still plugged in. When it was finished, the three of them stood in the doorway and looked at it. It's good, Mason said. Yeah, Landon said. It's really good. Serena stood in the doorway of the room that had been closed for 6 years, the room where grief had lived sealed and static, and looked at what it had become, warm and full of books, and lit with the particular afternoon light that came through the window she'd had cleaned for the first time in memory. And she was quiet for a long moment. I kept her nightlight in it, she said. Not to either of them specifically. To the room, maybe. To the idea of Ivy. I know, Mason said. He had a way of responding to things adults said that weren't technically addressed to him, with calm directness, as though the distinction between addressed to me and overheard was not one he found meaningful. Because she liked light, right? Serena looked at him. You said she didn't like the dark, Mason said. So now the room has light. That's good. Serena crouched down to his level, which she did less carefully now than she had at the beginning, less deliberately, less consciously. She looked at him with the expression that Landon had come to understand was what Serena's face did when she was feeling something she didn't have a word for and wasn't going to try to find one. Yes, she said, that's exactly right. Mason patted her shoulder with the slightly awkward sincerity of a small person who had decided a physical gesture was called for and was executing it with intention, if not expertise. Can I put a book in it? He said. One of mine. So I have something to read when I'm here. Pick any shelf you want, she said. He went in immediately with purpose and began his selection process, pulling books out and considering them with the gravity of a curator. Landon stood in the doorway and watched his son install himself in the room and watched Serena watch him and understood that this, right here, this ordinary Saturday afternoon with paint chips still in a bag by the door and the smell of fresh shelving in the air and a 5-year-old conducting a serious literary audit, was the thing. Not the dramatic moments or the hard-won confrontations or the particular night in a dark office when everything had started. Those mattered. But this was the thing. This was what they'd been moving toward through all of it. The ordinary. The warm, specific, imperfect ordinary. Spring came and the city exhaled the way it always did after a long winter, like a person who'd been holding their shoulders up around their ears for months, finally letting them drop. The park on Greer Avenue had its regulars back. The cafe on Wellman Street put 2 tables outside that Rio set up and took down depending on the morning, and which Landon and Serena used when it wasn't raining and moved inside when it was. They had stopped keeping the Thursday morning coffee on a formal schedule. It happened when it happened, which was more often, not less. The structure had been a scaffold, and they'd outgrown the scaffold, and now it was just their morning, whenever morning was available. They were not performing ease, there were still hard days. There were still Tuesdays that arrived with their particular weight, still nights when Serena went quiet in a way that wasn't about the present, but about the 6 years before it. Still moments when Landon looked at Mason doing something that Claire had done, a gesture, a way of tilting his head when he was thinking, and felt the familiar catch in his chest that didn't get smaller, so much as it became something he'd learned to carry without bracing for it every time. What had changed was that they carried it together now. That was the difference. Not that the weight was gone, just that there were 2 sets of hands on it. Donna had come up from Millfield in March with Ray, officially to visit Mason, obviously also to evaluate Serena with the thorough and transparent interest of a woman who had loved a daughter and was now observing the person her son-in-law had brought into his life. Serena had known she was being evaluated and had met it directly, not performing warmth, not being strategic, just being present and honest and willing to sit in the kitchen with Donna for an hour while the men took Mason to the park and talk about whatever Donna needed to talk about. Landon had come back from the park to find them at the kitchen table with tea and something that smelled like it had come from a bakery bag Donna had brought, and the conversation had clearly been real and probably difficult in places, and Serena's expression when he walked in was the expression of someone who had been through something and was on the other side of it. Donna had pulled him aside while Serena was in the other room with Mason and said, "She's not trying to replace Claire. I want you to know I can see that. She's not trying to be something she's not." "No," Landon said. "She's not." "She lost her own child," Donna said, and her voice was careful with it, the way you carried something fragile. "I didn't know that. Ray told me, but I don't think I understood until I talked to her." She looked at her hands for a moment. "She loves Mason. It's real." "I know." Donna nodded. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and she was not a woman who arrived at conclusions easily, and the fact that she had arrived at this one in an afternoon in a kitchen over tea and bakery goods meant something. "Take care of her," she said, "and take care of yourself." "I'm trying," Landon said. "I know you are." She put her hand briefly on his cheek the way mothers did, direct and without apology. She'd want this for you, you know that. Yeah, he said. I know. 1 year after the night in the dark office, a Tuesday in April, which Landon noted privately, and which he suspected Serena noted too, she called him from her car outside his apartment building at 9:30 at night and said, "Come outside for a minute." He came outside. She was parked at the curb, window down, the April night cool and smelling like rain that had stopped 2 hours ago. She looked like she'd driven there after sitting somewhere else for a while, which he understood because he'd done that many times himself. "You okay?" he said. "Yes." She looked out the windshield. "I drove by the office on the way here. The 42nd floor lights were off. It's 9:30 on a Tuesday." "I know, I haven't stayed that late on a Tuesday in—" She paused. "A while." He understood what she was saying. "Is that okay?" "It's strange," she said. "And okay. Both." She looked at him then. "I listened to the song tonight, in the car. The whole thing through, not just parts of it." She paused. "And I thought about Ivy, and I didn't feel like I was drowning. I just felt like I was remembering her." She said it with a careful honesty, the way you reported something you weren't sure you believed yet. I don't know if that's the same as healing or if healing is even the right word, but it felt different than it used to. Landon leaned on the car door. Above them, the city did its nighttime thing. Not quiet, never quiet, but a particular frequency of noise that was almost like quiet if you'd grown up with it. "I told Mason about Claire last week," he said. "Really told him. Not the simple version. He's old enough now to start asking the questions that need real answers." He looked at the street. "We looked at photos. I told him stories about her, things she did, things she said, the way she laughed. He asked me if I missed her." He paused. "I said yes, every day. And he said, 'Is that why sometimes you're sad?' And I said yes. And he said, 'That's okay. I'm sad sometimes too. But then I'm also happy. Can you be both?' And I said yes. 'You can be both.' And he said good and went back to his dinosaurs." Serena was quiet for a moment. "He said that," she said. "He said that. Your kid is something else, Landon." "Yeah." He almost smiled. "He's something else." She opened the car door and got out. Not with purpose, just to be out of the car, standing on the sidewalk in the April night. He stood next to her, and they both looked at the street. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay." She turned to face him. She was doing the thing she did when she'd decided to say something real. The slight squaring of her shoulders, not defensive, more like how an archer stands before releasing. "I want you and Mason to move in. I'm not asking because it's convenient or practical or because it makes sense on paper. I'm asking because this—" She gestured, a small motion between them and up toward his lit apartment window. "This is where I want to be, you and him, together in the same house. I want to wake up and have you there. I want Mason to have a home that's bigger than a 7th-floor apartment. I want—" She stopped, and the prepared speech ran out, and what was left was just her voice, undressed of its precision. "I just want you there. I want you both there." He looked at her. He thought about the night he'd stood in a hallway and heard music from behind a door that hadn't latched. He thought about granola bars and budget reviews and a woman dancing alone in the dark. He thought about coffee at 7:15 and the park on Saturday and a cloud-shaped nightlight that had been waiting 6 years to be plugged back in. He thought about Claire saying Mason needs his dad present, not preserved. He thought about his son sitting cross-legged on a turtle rug reading a dead child's book, with the casual, complete ease of a kid who had decided where he belonged. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. "Okay," he said again, with more certainty. "Yes, we'll move in." She let out a breath. Not dramatic, not a gasp, just a breath, like something that had been tight for a long time releasing by one notch. Then she did something she didn't often do, which was reach for him first. She put her arms around him and he put his arms around her, and they stood on the sidewalk outside his apartment building on a Tuesday night in April, and held on with the specific force of people who know what it costs to lose someone and understand that because of that, not in spite of it, what they're holding is worth holding. He thought about grief and love living in the same space. He thought about how you didn't get to choose to carry only one of them, and how anyone who told you the goal was to stop grieving had it wrong. The goal was to build something big enough to hold the grief inside it without being only the grief. A life wide enough to contain the loss without being defined by it. He was still working on it. They both were. It wasn't done, and it probably never would be, fully, and that was all right. Because he told Mason the next morning at breakfast, in the same direct way Mason had taught him to tell him things, without excessive preparation, without softening the information so much it became unrecognizable. Just, here is the thing. Mason ate a spoonful of cereal and thought about it. Like, move our stuff there? He said. Yes. Gerald too? Gerald too. All of it. Another spoonful. The thinking face. The head tilt. The Claire thing. Can I put my drawings in the reading room? You'd have to ask Serena, Mason nodded, satisfied with this answer. He appeared to consider the matter resolved. Okay, he said. That's all you have to say? Mason looked up at him. Dad, he said, with the patient tone of a child explaining something the adult is behind on. I already live there. My books are there. Gerald went there last Thursday. I put my rock collection on the windowsill in the reading room 3 weeks ago. He looked back at his cereal. I was just waiting for you to catch up. Landon stared at his son. You put your rock collection? She said the windowsill got good light. He ate more cereal. She was right. Landon sat back in his chair and felt something that was funny and overwhelming and entirely good rise up in his chest. His son had moved in 3 weeks ago in increments of rocks and drawings and library books, with the patient certainty of a 5-year-old who had assessed the situation and made his decision and was simply waiting for the adults to get there. He laughed. Actually laughed. The kind that came from somewhere real and wasn't managing anything, just was. He laughed until Mason looked at him with the long-suffering expression of a child who found adults inexplicable. You're being weird, Mason said. Yeah, Landon said, still laughing. I am. There are things that cannot be recovered. This is the truth that grief teaches first and teaches hardest. The lesson that arrives like a wall you walk into because you couldn't see it in the dark. Claire Pierce, Daniel and Ivy Blake. People who existed with full specific weight, their habits and their voices and the particular way they took up space in the rooms they were in, and who are gone with a completeness that nothing can touch. You don't get them back. This is not a story about getting people back. What it is a story about is what happens after. The long, unsupervised, nonlinear after. The part that doesn't have a map because no one who's gone through it has been able to agree on what the territory looks like. The part where you show up for your son's breakfast and your budget reviews and the park on Saturday and Tuesday evenings that used to be the worst night of the week, and do it again the next day, and the day after that, and somewhere in the accumulation of all those days, find that you've been building something without quite knowing you were. Landon Pierce was 33 when he carried the last boxes into Serena's house in Dalverton Hills on a Saturday in May, with Mason directing operations from the front steps with an authority that implied he considered himself the project manager of the move and was prepared to give feedback. The house that had been underfurnished and too quiet and full of closed doors was full of noise by noon. Mason's running commentary, Landon's instructions to the friend he'd enlisted to help with the heavy boxes, Serena's voice from the kitchen asking if anyone wanted coffee with a tone that suggested she'd already made it, and this was a formality. Serena Blake was 31. She was still the CEO of Vantara Capital. She still worked too many hours sometimes and still occasionally reorganized the living room furniture when she was stressed and still had Tuesdays that arrived with their particular weight. She had learned by degrees and imperfectly to let someone else carry the other end of those Tuesdays with her. The board had moved on. Warren Cole had moved out of Carver City earlier in the year. She'd heard this secondhand and had felt, when she heard it, mostly nothing, which was the appropriate feeling. The whispering campaign had died the natural death of things that run out of air. Her record spoke for itself, as records built over 7 years tended to. The cloud nightlight stayed in the reading room. Some things you keep and don't explain. Ivy's photo was on the nightstand and Claire's was on the bookshelf in the living room, in a frame Mason had picked out with the same executive certainty he'd applied to everything, and this was not a compromise or a negotiation, but simply the truth of what this house contained. All of them, the living and the gone, the love that had been and the love that was still happening. Mason Pierce, 5 years and 4 months old, installed Gerald the elephant on his new windowsill with the same care he'd given the rock collection, then pulled out the book about the bear who couldn't sleep, Ivy's book, which Serena had given him after he'd read it 3 times on the turtle rug, and declared that he was going to read in the reading room until lunch. "It's my room too now," he told Landon. Serena said, "When did she say that?" 3 weeks ago." He looked up. "I told you, you're always behind." He went upstairs. His footsteps on the stairs were the specific small thud of a child who had not yet learned to move quietly through a house, and the sound went through every room. Serena appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, coffee in both hands, and held one out to Landon. He took it. They stood in the hallway of the house that was no longer empty and listened to Mason settle into the reading room above them, the creak of the window seat, the small sound of a book being opened. "He said you're always behind," Serena said. "I know, I heard. He's right. I know that too." She looked at him with the expression that wasn't professional or controlled or managed, just hers, the one underneath all the other ones, the one that had been there from the beginning in a dark office on the 42nd floor when a door hadn't latched and a wrong turn became the right one. He looked back at her the same way. Outside, the May morning was going about its business. The city, indifferent as always to what was happening inside any particular house on any particular street, moved through its ordinary routines with the relentless, cheerful chaos of a place that had no memory and no expectations and no interest in anything except the next hour. Trees on the Dalverton Hills street were coming in full and green. Someone down the block was mowing. The air smelled like cut grass and coffee and the specific clean smell of a morning that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it was going to be. This is what it looks like, Landon thought. Not the version for movies where grief resolves into clean joy, and the bad days are behind you and the music swells to indicate that the hard part is over. The real version. The version where you're standing in a hallway holding coffee with someone who has been through the unsurvivable and survived it anyway, listening to your son read a book that belonged to a little girl who isn't here, and all of that is present in the room simultaneously. The loss and the love and the ordinary morning and the work still to do and the thing you're building in the middle of all of it. He had not stopped missing Claire. He was not going to stop. He knew now that missing her was not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be lived inside of, the way you lived inside weather. Not wishing it were different, but dressing for it, planning around it, standing in the rain sometimes without trying to be anywhere else. He thought she would have liked the coffee. Serena made it strong, probably too strong by most standards, and Claire had always made it too strong too, and he'd pretended to complain about it for 8 years of mornings and had not once actually wanted it any other way. "What are you thinking about?" Serena said. "Coffee," he said. She looked at him. "And other things," he said. She leaned against the wall beside him, close, not performing distance, just there. He could feel the warmth of her beside him, the solid, real physical fact of her presence, which he still sometimes registered with a faint surprise that wasn't unpleasant. That she was here. That they were here. That the night in the dark office had been the beginning of something rather than just an accident. "We're going to be okay," she said. Not as a promise, as an observation, as someone noting something they'd just confirmed by looking. "Yeah," he said. "We are." Upstairs, Mason read. The cloud nightlight glowed in the reading room in the middle of a bright May morning, which was unnecessary and exactly right. The house held all of them, the ones present and the ones carried, the daily noise of the living and the quiet weight of the gone, and did not collapse under any of it. This is what choosing looks like, when you've learned what it costs not to. Imperfect and ongoing and nothing like the end of a story. More like the beginning of the part after the hardest part, which is the part no one talks about as much, but which turns out, if you let it, to be worth every difficult step it took to get there. They had not replaced the people they'd lost. They had done the harder, stranger, more human thing. They had kept them and kept moving anyway, and found that the world was large enough to hold both. Outside, the morning made up its mind. Warm, clear. The kind of day that didn't ask anything of you except to be in it. Mason's voice came down from the reading room, slightly theatrical, because he was at an exciting part. "Dad, Rena, the bear found the problem." "What's the problem?" Landon called up. A pause. Pages turning. "He just needed someone to stay up with him for a while," Mason called back. "That's all?" Then he was okay. Serena looked at Landon. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said better. He finished his coffee. She finished hers. Upstairs, Mason read on, his small voice sounding out the words with the careful attention of someone who understood already that stories mattered, that the right one, told at the right time, could do something to a person that nothing else quite could. He wasn't wrong about that. He wasn't wrong about much, their boy. He never had been.